Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this third session of the 11th Annual Refugee Law Initiative Seminar Series, which we're really thrilled this year to run in partnership with the Platform on Disaster Displacement. I'm David Cantor, and as Director of the Refugee Law Initiative, it's my great pleasure to briefly recall for us all the concept behind this year's seminar series on human mobility, natural hazards, and policy responses. In short, the 6 webinar sessions in this series each approaches from a different angle the question of how can law and policy engage with the impacts of natural hazards on human mobility. In this vein, the initial 2 sessions explored, firstly, the analytical concepts that we use to frame or understand this empirical issue, and secondly, the data that exists on the characteristics and dimensions of the phenomenon. This third session turns now to the highly topical global policy debates on how to respond to human mobility in the context of natural hazards. The session does so by showcasing views from the 4 distinct institutional or thematic perspectives of our speakers, before opening up for broader discussion, questions and comments. To moderate this distinguished panel, I'm delighted to now introduce our moderator for today's session, herself a leading proponent in these debates, Dina Birkeland, the Senior Advisor on Disaster Displacement and Climate Change at the Norwegian Refugee Council. Dina, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome to all of you online in various places. So mostly good afternoon, I guess, but also some good mornings to people coming in from across the Atlantic. In today's seminar, as David already said, the main focus is on global policy debates and how human mobility and natural hazards are covered in this. We will look very much on 4 specific policies, but also related policies. So the global compacts on migration and refugees, the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, Paris Agreement under the climate change negotiations, and of course the task force on displacement that are under the UNFCCC. For the panel today, we have 4 speakers, and you see on the slide that's up there the name and affiliation, but I will still say it. We will first start with Dina Ionesco from IOM, the International Organization for Migration. Then we will move on to Andrew Harper from UNHCR, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Then thirdly, we have Ezekiel Simperingham from IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And our last speaker is the distinguished Professor Mirzan from the International Center for Climate Change and Development. We have for this session and at all these seminars been told by the organizers that we need to be strict on time. So I will already now say that that's one of my jobs, is to make sure that each of the speakers keep to their 8 minutes. And I will try to help them by showing a sign when we reach that time. We will also save some time by not listing long biographies, because everyone has in this seminar. But you can see them to your right in the chat box, where you find the full biographies of everyone. Another housekeeping issue is, of course, that on Zoom, we will use the chat to ask questions. So please put your questions there as you have them, and then we will come back to them in a Q&A after the 4 presentations. And finally, do mute yourself and also switch off your camera unless you're speaking. So we will try to keep the bandwidth at a size where everyone can connect. Then we will quickly move over to our first speaker, Dina from IOM. I know she will be using a PowerPoint, so you will also see that on the screen. So over to you, Dina.
Thank you so much, Nina. Can you hear me well?
We hear you loud and clear. We're just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up.
Okay.
So I suggest maybe you start
I start, yeah. So I'm at home. I'm also with family around, so I hope there won't be interruption that that will make it strange. But I'm gonna start. So what I've been asked to do today is to offer a glimpse on our theme today, from really the migration perspective and from the Global Compact on Migration, particularly interpretation and understanding. So if we can go to the first slide, please. I don't have the control of the slide, so I think it's can you try to, yes, voila, thank you so much. Okay, so what I wanted to say first of all is that for many years, for those who engaged on this topic, on looking at migration, climate change, disaster, and natural hazards and environmental degradation, we focused very much on impacting the climate negotiations. Because the climate negotiations was the space where states were meeting, discussing, and negotiating. So a lot of our community of practice on migration, environment, and climate change has focused first on bringing human mobility and migration issues, displacement issues, planned relocation into the climate discussions. So there's a turning point really in the history a bit of how the nexus on migration and climate change has grown with the New York Declaration in 2016 and with the Global Compact on Migration. So that's what I wanted to highlight at the beginning, is that the Global Compact on Migration is for the first time that states have negotiated a migration-focused text. And it's under the UN auspices, of course, and not all countries have signed at the end the document, but it's a very advanced migration governance document. And it's historically important for us, given all the past years till 2016, where nothing was advancing on climate change and in the migration field. So on this slide, you can see that the GCM articulates a 360-degree vision on migration. And what is interesting about the GCM is that it really provides very strong language on climate change, on disasters, on natural hazards, on environmental degradation, very specifically, for instance, on land degradation. So it's unique that we have now this anchorage. It's in objective 2 of the Global Compact on Migration. You have very specific paragraphs that really tackle different elements of this nexus. The objective 5 of the Global Compact on Migration is also extremely important for our discussion today, because it says that in some cases, and in the cases where people cannot adapt and we cannot mitigate the negative and impacts of climate change on people's livelihoods, there is a vision to provide enhanced flexibility pathways for regular migration, so that migration appears as part of the solution. And that's the key, one of our key messages on looking on the topic from this perspective. Another element I think that's key about the Global Compact on Migration is the predominance of the human rights approach. So a migrant-centered approach, and also conforming to existing human rights framework. Next, please. With this second slide, I will not go in any detail. I wanted to share this with the participants, an interpretation and an analysis of the GCM in 10 takeaways. I wanted just to highlight maybe number 4, that shows, that puts the accent nevertheless. So there is a focus on providing regular pathways for migration. There is an understanding that migration is part of the solution. However, even the GCM highlights that climate mitigation and adaptation measures in countries of origin should be prioritized to minimize the drivers of migration, and in particular of displacement. So I wanted to highlight this. If you look in my takeaway number 9, it highlights also the key role of state-led initiatives such as the Nansen Initiative, recognizing how much this kind of soft law approaches are key also to addressing the issue of climate change and migration. Maybe also number 6, I think it's what I find extremely interesting about the GCM. It really provides a focus on slow onset. So on very long-term, also extreme heat, degradation, lack of water, lack of resources. I think this is extremely important to know that we do have this language in the GCM. Next slide, please. So what do we do now with the GCM? I think that's key. It's very important, I think, to know that we have an anchorage because it's unique. And what happens now is how do we implement it? So the GCM is based also on a UN migration network. Ireland has a coordination role for the network, but the key ways of implementing the GCM are through regional and through national commitments that are going first to regional reviews in the first phase. Right now, I think we had one for Eastern and Central Europe and Central Asia. Next one, it will be on the Central America and the Caribbean. And there's also a linkage that is about implementing the commitments at national level. So for Ireland, one of our key objectives is to support states in the implementation at national level of the GCM commitments. The regional level is extremely important in the governance of migration. It's the level where maybe the governance of migration at international global level has most advanced over the past years. And I put on this slide a few examples of how regional policy dialogues, in particular going through regional consultative processes on migration, are advancing our understanding, the evidence, the knowledge, but also the dialogue and the policy development at regional level. So you have the Pacific example. We have a major program now funded by the United Nations Human Security Trust Fund in the Pacific that advances really the vision of, thank you, Dina, of the GCM. We have the example of the Caribbean, and we have an example also in West Africa with a French-funded program that also enhances the regional cooperation with a very strong focus on migration. And last slide for my last 30 seconds. Thank you. I want to just conclude once again that what I think is extremely important for our discussion is that to look at the migration lens, at migration management, at the migration vision, and that's why Ireland's role is important because it's a migration mandated organization, to think very concretely migration policy and practice, and that's aligned with the Nansen initiative and the protection agenda and the Nansen policy toolbox. It is about providing very concrete solutions: visas, entry, stay, consular services, diaspora investment. It is very concrete, and migration can be part of a solution if it's regular, safe, and orderly, and that is the vision. And to conclude, I wanted to just say one word on policy coherence. I think this is key. That all these different negotiated texts are building on each other. And I will just mention that we have a decision 10/24 from Katowice on climate with the task force on displacement under the UNFCCC. So the key track we have on migration and climate change under the UNFCCC that very specifically quotes the GCM. So we have these anchorages that support each other, and of course the Human Rights Council also on human rights and climate change. So I will end up here. Thank you so much. I think there might be a last slide with some links. Yes, I encourage everyone to look on the Environmental Migration Portal, which is like a golden mine of information, and to don't hesitate to have a look at all the different policy perspective and very operational examples and research examples and communication ones. Thank you, Nina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina, and thank you for, in this short time, being able to kind of outline the migration management policies, but also how these now are getting into operationalizing on a regional and national level. I think also very important to keep pointing out to the need for policy coherence. And the next speaker we have is from Andrew Harper from UNHCR, and he will speak to the other sister compact coming out from the New York Declaration back in 2016 when we got the New York Declaration, and then after the two compacts. So Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina, and thanks, David, and everyone else at ATLER for convening this. I think it's particularly important. And I think anyone who knows the work of UNHCR would also understand that the issue of policy in relation to climate change and disaster displacement has really become quite a key element in the evolution of policy, dare I say. And if we just look at today we, with IOM, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Platform of Disaster Displacement. Last week, there was a special session as part of the High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection on climate and the impact of climate on future protection needs. And so across the board, the policy is evolving. It's not that we're looking to extend mandates or that we're looking to set up new processes, but what we are recognizing is that climate change and environmental degradation and disasters are leading to enhanced population displacement. And as a consequence, like any policy or any convention, it has to evolve over time. And this is something which we're working very closely with our key partners, including IOM and PDD and member states, to see how we can identify where gaps may exist and ensure that those gaps can be addressed, not necessarily by UNHCR or anyone else, but to see who is best placed. Like, we can't afford for people to be put in more vulnerable situations, because there's, going back to even the IPCC from 2014 report on displacement of populations, it was noting how serious climate change will have on the frequency intensity of sudden onset natural disasters, how slow onset disasters will lower the threshold for people to flee, and how climate change can serve as a threat multiplier, which exacerbates the potential for conflict. We also need to stress in all these discussions that the interlinkages between climate change and displacement are multi-causal, they're complex, and the attribution for why somebody moves is never simple. And this is one of the reasons why we have to be much more collaborative in the way in which we approach the development of policies, how we look at the collection of data and the analysis. And again, this is why it's so important that we work with other sister agencies such as IOM, but also the NGO community and member states, so that we have a complete overview of what is the impact of climate change, and what are the reasons why people are moving. So, and this has been discussed numerous times before. So, what climate refugees is not something which exists in international law. The vast majority of people who are impacted by climate change and extreme weather events are displaced inside their own borders, until such point that they may need to cross an international frontier. So it's only at that point, when people are forced to go across an international frontier, that we could be looking at whether there's a nexus with conflict and whether people would fit under the 1951 Convention. But there's a number of reasons why we're particularly looking at the impact of climate change and environmental degradation, is because, as has been quite well noted already, is that climate change can make very fragile states almost turn into failed states. It can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It can lead to people having to move. It can lead to people being impacted by conflict and violence. And unfortunately, what we're also seeing is that when climate change, actually maybe the next slide as well, I should have said. So when climate change does impact, and next one after that, I think I've already gone past those. When climate change does force populations to move, and combination of climate, environmental degradation, and conflict, when there's an opportunity to return, it's often very difficult for populations to return because the land is no longer sustainable. And so it may not be able to provide the livelihoods or so forth that people will be able to return in safety and dignity. So what we've been looking at is increasingly is where is this nexus between climate change, environmental degradation, vulnerability, fragility, conflict, violence, and seeing where there is a nexus which is causing people to move. The other issue is that the vast majority of refugees and displaced populations are often located in very inhospitable, climate sensitive zones. And so whether it be in Chad or in Bangladesh or in Southern Africa, we're having our displacement settlements very adversely impacted by climate change already. So what does the Global Compact on Refugees say? As Nina was mentioning, adopted in 2018. It acknowledges the increasing displacement in the context of disasters and climate change, and provides the basis to address these challenges. And it focuses on a number of three key areas: responsibility sharing. And again, it's a key element for the Global Compact on Refugee and Global Refugee Forum. How do we work more effectively with others, including with IOM, with IFIs, with NGOs, with development actors, with member states? How do we take advantage, well, not take advantage, how do we utilize more effectively national arrangements, agreements, sub-regional platforms, without necessarily going straight into what does the international covenant say? In many aspects, it's the regional agreements, whether it be the Kampala Convention or the Cartagena Declaration. These are the ones which are probably providing much more basis for protection than international instruments. Prevention and root causes. The Global Compact on Refugee references the need for disaster risk reduction, preparedness, early warning and early action. And also very much in relation to calling, yep, got it, Nina, calling how we can work, again, not only UNHCR, but how do we ensure that the overall protection regime is as solid as possible to respond more effectively to the growing risks, whether it be slow onset disasters impacting countries in the South Pacific, whether it be the issues of internal displacement. As I mentioned, the vast majority of people who have been forced to move are because of basically find themselves internally displaced. So the GCR, and this is 5 points I'm just going to say, we need to ease the pressure on host countries and communities. We need to enhance the self-reliance. We need to expand third country solutions. We need to support conditions in countries of return. And what I'd add to that is making sure that there's a gender focus, make sure that we're looking at groups who are in vulnerable environments to make sure that they're not made more vulnerable. And how can we support adaptation, resilience, preparedness, so people are not forced to move in the first place? Over.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you also to you keeping on time. This is excellent. Again, I think what was important in your presentation is how we need to better understand the attribution of drivers of displacement in the context of climate change and disasters. And you didn't mention, but I also wanted to highlight that you as UNHCR 2 months ago published new legal considerations on how to clarify on how to use refugee law in the context of climate change. So I know those are out, and I'm sure there will be also a lot of interest to learn more about how to actually use this in reality. I also really much appreciate it, and I hope that will also lead to questions about how to operationalize the GCR and what you're already doing as UNHCR. Before I let our next speaker in, I will again just remind participants that we have the possibility to ask questions in the chat. There is already a few coming in, but don't be shy. So as we then have pointed to that possibility, I will hand over to Ezekiel, who will speak on behalf of IFRC. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nina. I guess we're 9 months into this pandemic, but I should check that you can hear me okay. Okay, good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, I guess, behind another screen for many of us. But thank you also to David, the Refugee Law Initiative, and to Atle at the Platform on Disaster Displacement for this invitation, for this opportunity to share some reflections on behalf of the IFRC. And I think, as is well known by probably most people on the webinar today, and as well expressed by Dina and Andrew already, the deceptively simple question for this webinar: how can law and policy engage with the impact of natural hazards on human mobility, with a focus today on global policy? It's actually an especially complex question. And so I don't think any of us will be able to fully answer this question, especially not in 8 minutes, Nina. So from my side, I thought it would be most useful to highlight some areas that we at the IFRC, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, where we are working on at the moment, related to this issue in support of communities, in support of governments, in support of our 192 member Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, across the world who are daily grappling with this complex issue. And do you mind advancing the slide, please, colleagues? Perfect, thank you. And so the first point, again, this may be clear or obvious to people here today, but I think it always bears restating, is that when we look specifically at the issue of displacement as a form of human mobility, in the context of natural hazards, disasters, and climate change. And particularly when we're thinking about the treatment of this issue as part of global policy, we need to recognize that this form of displacement is actually, for the most part, preventable. This is in some ways very distinct from conflict-related displacement and displacement connected to persecution and human rights abuses. We can act now, we should act now through very practical initiatives to protect communities from becoming forcibly displaced. This does not mean to stop or prevent people from leaving their homes, but simply to take steps to enable individuals, households, and communities to have the choice whether to leave their homes or not. And there are two major ways that we and others are helping communities to do that, helping communities to be protected where they are. And these are also part of the global policy approach. The first is through broader disaster risk reduction and resilience building initiatives, as well as adaptation measures mentioned by Andrew. And the important connections between DRR, disaster risk reduction, resilience, and displacement are already recognized in a number of global policy documents, particularly in the Sendai Framework on DRR. And what is even better is that beyond the global frameworks, there is already excellent practical guidance on how to turn these words into action, in the form of specific guidance related to disaster displacement with a relatively long title, How to Reduce Risks, Address Impacts, and Strengthen Resilience. It's an excellent guide that Nina and many of the colleagues here today put together and contributed to. So perhaps we can share a link to that guide in the chat or somehow with participants. But this is a big topic, undertaking disaster risk reduction and resilience building to reduce displacement risk. But the main idea and approach that we are following is firstly to have a strong foundation of community-led risk and capacity assessments and analysis so that we can better understand local level risks that communities face, as well as their capacity for responding to those risks. And then secondly, to design interventions to support those communities to be able to stay in place. And these interventions can range from nature-based solutions, such as planting and restoration and conservation of mangroves to protect against storm surges or erosion, initiatives to reinforce housing, shelter, critical infrastructure, activities to protect and diversify livelihoods for people to be able to maintain and continue and develop new skills and jobs in areas where livelihoods are no longer becoming sustainable. The next slide, please. Thank you. The second point is that although we can and should prevent much displacement connected to natural disasters, natural hazards, disasters, and climate change, in many cases, there will continue to be displacement that is unavoidable. And even before we get to that moment of displacement, there are preparedness measures that we can take now to prepare communities for displacement, and also the communities that may host the displaced populations. These measures are also referenced in the Sendai Framework and the Global Compact on Migration, as mentioned by Dina. And at the local level, at the practical level, what these guiding global documents are saying can be done and should be done is a range of activities, from community risk information and awareness on the nature of disaster and climate risks, including evolving risks, the nature and location of evacuation routes and places where displaced people can flee to for protection. These preparedness measures can also include ensuring that locations for displacement are accessible, that they're dignified, and that they are safe. And I think a quick note there, and it would be almost impossible not to mention it in 2020, that a lot of these preparedness measures that we are supporting are already impacted because of COVID-19. And so we have already had to adapt many of these measures for COVID-19 context. For example, in evacuation centers for displaced people who fled Cyclone Amphan, which occurred in May in Bangladesh and parts of India. This year, simple things such as ensuring there is sufficient evacuation space for physical distancing, ensuring that there is hand sanitizer in evacuation centers and masks are available. We now need to make that a normal part of preparedness measures even before people are displaced. And slide, please. Thank you. A third point, colleagues, and we are now moving even closer to the point of actual displacement, is the role of anticipatory humanitarian action, and particularly anticipatory action based on forecasts. We, as humanitarians, maybe not speaking for everyone, but maybe, we often act too late. We realize this, we know that we need to act earlier. And so something we are looking at is the role of early action supported by forecast-based financing, which means that we have financing structures in place to facilitate and ensure humanitarian action in a very crucial window of time. It's the window of time between the forecast of a natural hazard occurring and that natural hazard actually hitting a community, and making sure that funding is available for local early actions in that window of time. Thank you, Nina. This is a crucial window when we are looking at displacement. We have seen examples from Mongolia to the Philippines to Mozambique to Bangladesh, where such early actions have prepared people for displacement, they have reduced the risks of displacement, and even prompted a faster return to normalcy. And a final slide and a final point in my final moments, please. Thank you. And this final point also brings the conversation squarely back to the law. And this is a point that you've mentioned also, Nina, is that there are strong global and increasingly regional frameworks emerging. And I think many of the people on the call here today and many of the colleagues listening in have been driving forces behind many of those frameworks. And this is truly an important feat globally, that we have such coherent and strong global frameworks in place. But these global frameworks are only as strong as the practice on the ground. And often, to a large part, this practice is determined by inclusion and reference in domestic legal frameworks and approaches. And on this specific issue, we are also working in support of governments around the world in their development of disaster laws, that is, disaster risk management law and policy. And it is critical that these laws, which often provide the regulatory framework for national and in some cases cross-border risk reduction, preparedness, anticipatory action, response, and solutions, as well as the roles and responsibilities of the various actors, it's critical that these domestic legal arrangements also reference the best norms of these global policy initiatives, and including human mobility and displacement considerations. Nina, I will end there in the interest of time, but I can also share some reports and references to our work related to disaster law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zeke. And again, thank you not only for focusing on the law, and I think what we've seen from many of these global policies is that we've been able to move on strategies, plans, etc., but how to get it into actual law on the national level is one way of making this operational that we still need to work closely together, many of us, and you're doing a fantastic job from IFRC on that. I think also the focus on anticipatory action and forecast-based financing is super important, because if we want to talk about preventive actions, these are tools that I should say, many of us as humanitarians haven't used enough in the past. And how do we use them now? I know you have some policy papers that maybe you dump the links into, specifically also for focusing on displacement and forecast-based financing, so people can find them thereafter. I see that more questions are coming, and that's excellent. That will keep our speakers busy after the introduction. We have one more presentation before we will open up for the Q&A, and we have Dr. Mirzan Khan, who will speak very much around the climate change negotiations. And we are very delighted to have him here today, because he has followed this for so long, and also long before anyone talked about human mobility and displacement in the context of the climate change negotiations. So over to you, Professor Khan.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. Yeah, I have been a negotiator for a long time, for the last 20 years, and I'm continuing, looking forward to going to Glasgow next November. So I will share first many of the points raised by Andrew and GK particularly have touched upon the ideas that I want to share, but I will elaborate on that. But first, let me share a little of the etymology of this agenda, how it did come under the UNFCCC negotiations. Actually, these issues started being talked of from 2007-08 from the Bali, when adaptation was put on the same pedal as mitigation. And then some humanitarian agencies like IOM, then UN Human Rights Commission, some research organizations led by the UN University in Bonn, and also the CAN International, they all banded together to do some research, and they have published also, brought out brochures and briefs on case studies to sensitize the negotiators. Then, you know, at COP 15 in Copenhagen, which was regarded as kind of a Brokenhagen or Hoffenhagen, where the initial text had some kind of formulations, but bracketed, but at the end of the day, extended for over 36 hours, you know, the 2.5-page Copenhagen, so-called Copenhagen Accord, coupled up by unprecedentedly by the 5 presidents globally of major powers, were not accepted at the final plenary session. It was just taken note of. But that Copenhagen Accord did not have any reference to migration or climate-induced displacement. But the following year at COP 16 in Cancun, which I also attended, there is the famous paragraph you all know, paragraph 14F, which internalized kind of the text, bracketed text that Copenhagen we had in Copenhagen, and that 3-line kind of decision adopted at COP 16 in under the Cancun adaptation framework is loaded, kind of. I will refer to 3 types of issues included in that 3 para decisions. First, about the level of mobility, for example, the expressions displacement, migration, and planned relocation is there, and so the levels of mobility. Then the levels of planning at the national, regional, and international level, relocation, this expression is there, and also the types of activities in terms of understanding or research, then coordination and cooperation. So that 3-line decision 14F para was very loaded, and we, the negotiators, are very, very optimistic that things are moving toward a better direction. Then, you know, Warsaw International Mechanism has been established at COP19, and then at COP21, para 49 established the task force on migration and displacement, but Article 8 of the Paris Agreement does have no kind of expression on migration or displacement. Even the 8 elements of work that under Article 8 is supposed to do does not include migration. So as a negotiator, I take this as kind of a great backtracking from para 14F. And now things are moving very slowly. The task force, now the second lease of life has been accorded at COP24 in Katowice, and they also have the second phase of their work plan. But these work plans mostly relate to, as a negotiator, I'm really very unhappy being a negotiator, but my government takes in, I'm not a government person. I always argue that if you don't have the skin of a hippopotamus, you cannot stand these endless hours of fruitless cooperation. In one of my books published by Routledge in 2014, I have mentioned these negotiations as a process of active inaction. But have no other option. UNFCCC is our main vehicle and has to be that. But civil society has to be much, much more active, like this refugee law initiative that I welcome. And then for the last 2 years, this task force has got a report you all have seen, and their main activities to data collection, assessments, planning, starting for enabling policy framework. But one thing that is good, something that they have tried, and this is established fact, that there is a connection between displacement and conflicts, both internally and beyond the border, spillover effects. Nowadays, we are having borderless climate risks, and there are quite a number of publications. I am also trying to write and publish one about borderless climate risks. So these issues are coming up. Simply, we need to go beyond planning, and for that, what Andrew has referred to about attribution. In fact, this is again a catch. In diplomacy, there's a constructed ambiguity, what I call ambiguity intentionally constructed by the powers that be, major powers, so that they have subjective leeway for interpretation of the text that they want to. That is one problem, and this relates to the convention. When we talk of attribution, IPCC science is a government-approved science, and that is the general causation. Now, a specific causation is specifically, for example, we had ILA in 2007, where we had more than 250 square miles per hour. Never we had in history. So extreme events have new normal. But because of holding us back, we still are harming, and the legal literature is still harping on to establish a specific causation, meaning that the events of one specific event has to be proved as cause of the events that we had. So this is a little funny, but attribution science is being developed. And GK mentioned few points. I am a climate finance negotiator. My main cup of tea at the negotiation is climate finance. Okay, so for adaptation, the climate-induced displacement is both a failure of adaptation in situ and an adaptation, successful adaptation ex situ. But ex situ adaptation doesn't happen that much because borders are restricted and major powers are doing studies on their security, climate change and securitization led by the military officials. not led by the development ministries, because we look at security displacement from the angle of human security, from the vulnerability perspective. But that is not happening. The military establishments, just about a month ago, I attended as a panelist at the Wilton Park Conference on Climate Change and Security, where I have highlighted this point, that climate change and security has to be led. This debate and discourse has to be led not by the military officials, but by the development ministries, focusing on vulnerability and human security. Only then adaptation can take place in situ. Now, talking of climate finance, for example, you all know that less than still 20% of the global climate finance comes to adaptation. And out of that, only 10%, IIED study has shown, only 10% of the 20% adaptation finance goes to the local communities, where in fact adaptation
excuse me, Mr. Khan. Time is very soon over, so if you can try to wrap up, please.
I will stop here. I will be very happy to participate in question and answer session. I have many things to say. So just last point, if we want adaptation to be a successful strategy for migration, then we need to focus on in situ adaptation. Because nobody having a good life, if they have a good life in situ, doesn't want to move ahead, move somewhere outside. So we need more and more adaptation finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Khan, and thank you for really giving a bit of the insight from the negotiator's perspective, because I think a lot of the people on this call, we are trying to influence people like you to make the right decisions. So this is super useful. I also want to really highlight what you pointed to towards the end of your presentation, where you talked about the securitization and how we see a kind of securitization debate coming up around human mobility and climate change, and how we really need to keep focusing on a rights-based approach, looking at vulnerabilities and not at the kind of military solution to this. So again, thank you for flagging that so clearly. We are through with the 4 presentations. There have come quite a few questions in the chat. Some of the speakers have been eager to respond already in the chat, so some is responded to, but I think it's also good to do it verbally with everyone. So the way I would like to do it is to kind of push it back to you as speakers, give you 2-3 minutes to try to respond to some of the questions that have been put forward to you. I will also try to keep a little tab that you actually respond to what has been asked to you. So if you don't do it, I will try to push you a bit further. So I think for this round, we will start with the, actually, I will start with the second last speaker. So Professor Khan has a chance to look back to what's come in the chat while he was speaking. So let's start with Zeke. And if you start to respond, 2-3 minutes maximum. And then we go to Professor Khan, then to Andrew Harper, and then Dina Ionesco as the last one to respond. There are some questions to all of you, and some questions that are very specific to one or maybe 2 of you. Over to you, Zeke.
Thanks, Nina. This is, I guess, the lucky first guinea pig for this new approach to me. There's a lot of great questions there. I just picked out a couple that I think are particularly interesting, and then maybe for the tab later, you can force me to answer the other ones if I've missed some. There was a question there about, I think, reacting to my point about the distinction between predominantly disaster and climate-related displacement and predominantly conflict and rights abusing related displacement. I think there's a few points to make about that distinction. One is that when we look at displacement in the context of disasters, and I don't know if we've got some colleagues from IDMC here, but you know, the global report on internal displacement is a good indicator of particularly internal displacement related to sudden onset hazards and disasters. The vast majority is weather related. And the vast majority of that weather related disaster are floods and storms, which are predominantly seasonal. So we, for the most part, know that they're coming. I would say they're predominantly seasonal, and then related to my other point, a lot of them are also forecastable. So some geophysical hazards, I mean, we know there are countries and communities along the Pacific Ring of Fire, for example, that are at risk. We don't have as much warning about them, but for seasonal events, which seem to be driving the largest numbers of displacement globally at the moment, not all of it, but large numbers of it, these are somewhat predictable, and we can identify those communities at risk, and we can take these measures, and we should take these measures now to protect them where they are. But at the same time, we have this global policy, the guiding principles on internal displacement, which for a lot of it really treats the two as equivalent: conflict-related internal displacement and disaster-related internal displacement. And okay, I'm going to run out of time. And I think that's also an area to look at, is delve more into the distinctions. And I'm pretty sure UNHCR and IOM are already doing some research on that. So maybe Andrew and Dina can make a comment there. In terms of the question from David about the successes and the challenges of our approach, or the strengths and the weaknesses of our approaches, from our side, I think the strengths we have are that we are local. We are present in 192 countries at the community level. The national societies are made up of the community, but they're connected to this global norms, global best practices, global initiatives. We have access in almost all communities across the world, which can be quite unique. We're connected to governments. But the challenge for us is that this issue is not a humanitarian issue alone. I think we've heard that this is an extremely complex issue. We can address humanitarian needs, we can reduce humanitarian risks, but just looking at this issue, you cannot look at just exposure alone. We have to look at vulnerability and need in a much broader picture of development, of land use planning, of marginalization, of discrimination, of governance models, and those things we as humanitarians struggle to address. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you very much, Ezekiel. You had several questions, and I think you covered most of them. There is one you did not cover, and I will want to flag it back to the rest of them, and then maybe you can pick it up again if you have time for a second round. It's from Laura Morel, who asks all the presenters. She says, my question is for all. How are frameworks exist, but how to engage states in the implementation of these frameworks? We can see that some states are reluctant to really implement the GCM, for instance, and she refers to the debate under UNFCCC on the GCM. So I've put that on the table for all of you. And then I would like to turn to Professor Khan. There was one specific question to you from Atle Solberg from the platform on disaster displacement, where he asks, first of all, he thanked for the experience and the perspectives presented, and he asked if you feel that the issue of human mobility under the UNFCCC negotiations has backtracked since Cancun and 2010, and how can the issue come stronger in again? And asking then concretely what to do preparing for COP26 and Glasgow and beyond. So over to you, Mr. Khan. You have to unmute Khan.
Yes, now you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, so, you know, UNFCCC is an intergovernmental process. So the governments go there and to represent their national interests. And the problem is, even under liberal democracy, as we see around the world, the real voices of the impacted people are not, in most of the cases, are not reflected and represented by the governments that represent the intergovernmental diplomacy under the UNFCCC. So the only viable option, UNFCCC intergovernmental process has to be there, as I mentioned, but the most viable option has to be that we need to spend more energy and resources to mobilize the civil society, because in developed countries particularly, the politicians are forced to respect the constitutional voices, unlike in many developing countries, because here in many developing countries, democracy is just for a day, the voting day, the voters get some money and vote for the candidate decided by the elites, either rural or, but not in industrial countries that happens so. So I think the awareness raising, another point here I mentioned that I always argue as a negotiator that let us invest more resources for sensitizing the citizens of the developed countries who are a little, who live a little away from nature, as GK has mentioned about nature-based solutions. But in developing countries, citizens live very much in nature and they live off nature. So we need to sensitize the citizenry globally, but particularly the developed country citizens, because if they can impact and impress upon their governments, then their governments have to listen to. And this negotiation depends, success of this negotiation depends on mostly 20 governments around the world, 20 governments. So if these governments are targeted, and if, for example, the sensitization team comprising of youth groups, for example, from developing countries are invited and how they suffer with little snapshots of their lives and meet the industrial country citizens, the university students, the politicians, and that I think will push a lot further to getting back to 14F paragraph, and we can have progress. And as I mentioned, another thing I wanted to mention, that we also need to focus on slow onset events. This DRR has got less than $5 of the $100 spent still for humanitarian assistance. So we need to invest more in pre-disaster, in disaster risk reduction. And also we need to do more research on slow onset events, because they are not sexy. They don't arouse the sentiments of the rapid onset events, because then humanitarian ethos called for more in rapid onset events. So I think we need to work and do research on multiple levels involving the citizens greatly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. And again, I'm impressed with this panelist, how you're able to stick to the rules about time. We have two more for the first round of questions or answers. Maybe we have time for a few more. Next one is Andrew, and I see you already been very active in the chat, but also I think, as I said, it'd be good to come back to the whole group with some of the responses. And one thing that I saw came as the first question was related to protection, and then the LGBTIQ people and how that is covered in this work. And I think for me, that's also a stepping stone to talk about how do you as UNHCR, as a protection mandate agency, how are you working with these issues when we take it from global policy to the operationalization and implementation. So over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the question. I can confirm that within our strategic framework on climate action, the position of LGBTQI and other groups are included as a key element, particularly in relation to not only to react to, but how can we ensure that they're empowered at the community level? And again, this is something which is not necessarily the remit of UNHCR, but how we can be working with the best placed actors on the ground so that we can support preparedness, resilience, adaptation, so people don't have to move in order to be protected. So it's preparedness in order to better protect. I think that's probably one of the key elements that we're after here. And one thing which we have been also looking at is how, and this goes back to also what Ezekiel was saying, how can we better be prepared? The science is getting increasingly clear about the impact, what are the pathways for climate change. As Professor Khan also mentioned, we can already anticipate where slow onset impact is going to lead to increased vulnerability of populations in the future. So what can we be doing now? How can we support, as he mentioned, adaptation? All these elements were raised and highlighted last week in the High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection and the specific issue on climate change, displacement, climate-induced displacement. So just to say that what we are looking at is building upon the discussions which we're all having. I think the next challenge is how do we operationalize that? And I think one of the key questions that came through in the chat was how do we address it at the regional level? And this is where it's going to be important for all of us to come up with a plan of action. What are the collective outcomes? What do communities want on the ground? What is it that the authorities want, so that we are not coming down from Geneva or New York or whoever and saying this is what you've got to do? What is it that they want us to do to help them? They know they're going to be in trouble. how can we support that adaptation rather than just talking about mitigation and what we're doing? So I think there's a lot we can do, but we need to be doing it together. We need to have agreed outcomes driven from the communities, and then we have to be accountable for making a difference. Over.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And again, thank you so much for highlighting what this really means for the communities, affected people living this, and also, of course, for the governments in countries affected. I think we might have time for one more round after. So if there's more questions that people want to ask, there's a chance to quickly put them in. And then I would like to hand over to Dina. You got some of the first questions in the chat, but also some of the last ones. So over to you. You have 2-3 minutes.
Thank you, Nina. I also sent a few links as part of my responses. I think for the regional reviews, it's important to see there are, I think, 6 regional reviews. So you have the Latin Americas and the Caribbean, Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, North America, and the Arab region. So I think it's 5, in fact, if I know still how to count. But there's a lot ongoing at sub-regional level. So a lot of stakeholder meetings, preparatory meetings for the GCM. So it's very lively. There are regional and national networks of the UN Migration Network. So I shared links so you can keep posted, because a lot of the deadlines and of the dates have been completely offset by the COVID situation. And I don't want to give you wrong information on when each consultation takes place. Another question I think I had was about what about the internal displacement? And I think this is key to clarify that today I really focus on the Global Compact on migration, which is about international governance of migration and cross-border displacement as well. And of course, it is extremely connected to everything that happens before people will go across the region. So indirectly, we speak very much about internal displacement. I think it's very important also to quote the high-level panel on internal displacement and the work of the special rapporteurs on the rights of the IDP, Cecilia Jimenez, on slow onset and displacement. And I shared IOM submission, but you have, of course, the OHCHR pages that give information on that. So issues are connected, but they are different as well. So we have to be very careful not to mix up. I would like to really take David's question about strengths and weaknesses, because I think it's an extremely interesting and challenging question. In my view, working on migration and climate change, there's a sensitivity, of course, and political load of the discussion that it's a major weakness and a huge strength. It's like the drawback of a great quality. So there's so much interest and spotlight, but you also hear a bit of everything and alarmistic and not correct information, and it's very heavy and loaded. So I think this is one of the key strengths and weaknesses, in fact, of the topic. And the other point, I think I'm very much worried that because migration has been now mainstreamed in the urban agenda, in the humanitarian agenda, in SDGs, it's everywhere. Everyone's business can be also no one's business. So that scares me very much. And I think it's both the strength and the weakness. And another strength and weakness is just the issue of the migration, what we say by migration, that hides so many different terminology issues, and we don't have one square legal definition of a migrant. So of course, this is a major issue. I don't think I have so much time. I just wanted to take a quick bite into the implementation question posed by Laura, because I think it is a key question. So the GCM has also a migration trust fund, and there's a lot of efforts to have financing in the trust fund that should become projects and programs. We have, for instance, in the pipeline a very big project with PDD, with ILO, with colleagues also from OHCHR and with UNHCR on climate-related issues, on disaster displacement in the IGAD region in Eastern Africa, to work with the Full Movement Protocol in the IGAD region. So I call this the fan of activities. We look at implementing this in many, many different ways. And I think you have also GCM champion countries. So we go a lot through the champion country approach, and IOM's new strategy on migration and climate change that we are developing now for the next decade goes very, very much through this champion country approach, where IOM works with champion countries and champion offices. And you have extremely concrete responses, for instance, green reintegration of returnees in Senegal or in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, extremely interesting and innovative programs. So I can't respond in more detail about this. There are so many different ways of implementing, and I remain very optimistic to see how much there's dynamism and how much the COVID-19 situation has brought more attention on connecting global health issues to climate issues and on targeting much more vulnerable populations. So I think we can still be worried and scared and very optimistic as well. So I think it's, yes, for me, it's the drawbacks of the qualities and the strengths of the weaknesses. And we'll have to accept migration. It's both a solution and puts so many people in very vulnerable situations. We have to take it all and address one by one through different kinds of solutions. Thank you, Nina. You gave me more than 1 minute. You haven't been tough on me. Thanks. You remove a minute from me next, okay?
Thank you so much, Dina. We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to do one more round with the panelists. There is one question that came into the chat towards the end now, which I think is very timely to address, because today is the 5th anniversary adaptation of the UN Security Council resolution on youth, peace and security. And the question that came in from Marcia Ensor at Georgetown University is very much around this. So what are the specific provisions that are being made to leverage the positive agency of young people in context of environmental displacement? So I would like to push that back to all of you as panelists. But I also would like you to go back to where we started, that yes, we have all these global policies and frameworks agreements, but now 4 or 5 years after most of these were agreed on a global level, what do you see as the 2 most or best effective actions to put them into concrete action or operationalize them, as you also often call? So 1 or 2 concrete actions that you think we need to take, either your agency, but as much us as a community, to put this into concrete action. And remember the youth question as well. Then I will start with Andrew and we'll end with you, Dina, so you know the order. So Andrew, Zeke, Professor Khan, and then Dina in the end. 1 minute max.
Done. It's not only youth. I think youth have probably got the biggest interest in making a change, and in many aspects they're the ones who've been driving the profile and discussion. It's all affected communities, and the youth represent probably the largest community that's going to be most affected by climate change. So as soon as we start talking to the communities on the ground and leave no one at the back of the tent, then it becomes standard that the youth are engaged. And so if you want to look at best practices, how do we work collaboratively so it's not just UNHCR or IOM or IFRC or the World Bank going to talk to these communities separately? How do we all just take advantage? Like this is a challenge which the world is facing, which we've never seen before. We have to change the way in which we work, change the way that we work as separate entities to say, well, we're in strife, the world is in strife, we need to look at collective outcomes, who is best placed to inform the decisions for the future. And it's got to be the communities on the ground, so we don't turn strong, proud people into vulnerable people that are forced to move. Over.
Thanks, Andrew. Then let's move on to Zeke.
Thanks, Nina, and thank you to the colleague who asked about youth. As Andrew says, it's not only about youth, but it's a topic particularly when we look at climate and the existential threat that climate change is posing. That youth have a particularly vested interest in us adults doing something about it. I mean, as the IFRC, we're a volunteer-led organization. We have a lot of youth volunteers. We have a lot of, I would say, procedures in place to ensure that youth are engaged. We have youth positions on our governing board at the highest levels, at all of our decision-making forums. It's something, but I think it's something we always need to work at. You can't just have an architecture in place where you have, you know, I would say a token youth representative. They need support, they need agency. And I would say, and I said this to our youth, we have a global network of youth representatives from Red Cross and Red Crescent around the world. And we had a conversation with them last year about climate change and displacement, and they're extremely passionate about this issue. And I said to them, you know, it's great that you have this voice and this forum, you know, but use it. Don't just say what you think we want you to say. Be young, be active, be dynamic, give us messages that we're not hearing in other forums, give us a different perspective, be bold, don't just try and get a job, you know, like just really be young and be dynamic and push us in directions that we're not going to get pushed in otherwise. You had another question about best practices, Nina, but maybe we save that for another day in the interest of time. Thank you.
Mr. Khan.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have a strategy kind of suggestion for two-pronged strategy. One is focusing on internal capacity building within the country. I lead the LDC Universities Consortium on climate change, where we have dedicated programs for the youth and the women, particularly focusing on youth group, both of boys and girls. And then our focus is to build capacity in many different ways, through formal education and through vocational training. So here, industrial countries and development partners can do a lot. Out of the adaptation finance, for example, a share can be dedicated specifically to building adaptive capacity among the youth, boys and girls. They can then contribute to their national development, because these countries suffer both from development deficit and adaptation deficit. But if they have capacity, they can contribute. And externally also, I believe already globally there are some countries in the global north having negative population growth. So whatever political rhetorics are there for anti-migration, your countries will need labor force. So my supposition is that if based on a planned assessment of your future needs, if based on partnership, bilateral, multilateral, if money can be invested for developing the required capacities that your countries need in 5 or 10 years globally, there could be a good group of young, energetic people with the desired skills. Go to your countries, even on temporary work permit. They can work for some years and then they can get back, and they get back with good money as well as good experience and good technological learning. So this way we have to look at a longer term perspective, not just for 2-3 year project. So our capacity building, ICAD, my institute focuses on capacity building, but we always argue that we are not ready to take a 2-3 year project. If you give us money, give us for 6-7 years minimum, then we will be happy to get the money, because capacity building is a process, not a discrete one-off act. So we need, for this kind of long-term programming, and development partners need to be sensitized and aware about this, that the key is capacity building, both for internally, for those countries, and for externally. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then, Dina, you promised to be short, but you do have the last word. We can't hear you if you're talking.
Yes, I couldn't find my unmute, sorry. So yes, for youth, I think I shared a link as well. We are just collaborating now with UNICEF. We hosted a webinar on this topic on youth and climate change and migration, and we are just preparing a paper on that topic. So I think we have a lot of interest in understanding better how to integrate. I think it's a question, a lot of education as well on climate change and migration for young people. Yeah, and for kids, I think, for children, not just, I don't know how we describe youth, but also kids. I think it's very important to start super early. And to your question on what I consider two main solutions or ways ahead, you had asked this question, Dina. I was going to say, for me, what I think it's a key message, it's the positive contribution of migrants and diasporas and communities. We have more and more interesting projects connecting green jobs, diaspora, remittances, transfer, returnees, where in fact the migrants are the actors of climate action. And I really want to highlight this. And the second maybe thing I would choose, it's really the migration, very maybe boring perspective, but which I think it's key for IOM side to, that's what we do as an international organization on migration. It's really the migration practice. It's greening, it's giving a climate vision, putting the climate lens on all traditional migration work we do. Reintegration, labor migration, migration and health, border management, everything can have a green twist to it. It can be also more about our own impact on the environment, the environmental sustainability, for instance, clean energy investments in camp situation or displacement situations. And this I want to highlight once again. For me, the strategy that we are developing now, it's really about this implementing very concretely, operationalizing. And that's what we discussed a lot also with Andrew and how we, with the task force on displacement, how do we make this concrete through our programs and presence in the field. So it goes through our offices in the field, through our colleagues who are there daily working on very concrete programs and projects, and who try to feed back into what I'm saying, that much more policy and bureaucratic level, the realities that come from the ground. So yes, migration practice, positive contributions. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you for taking us from policy to practice throughout your interventions today. I think that's really where we want to be. Now it's practice and action. I would first of all like to thank all of you as panelists for your presentations, your responses, your reflections with the panel, with the participants, but also I think it's really good to see the active participation. We have been around 60 participants in total today, and the number of questions and comments coming in has been very, very good. I want to say that these series of discussions are being recorded, so they will be put up on the websites of both PDD, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the Refugee Law Program, and as a podcast, so people can come back to it then. And as far as I know, they also make a short report, so all the good references and material being shared will be available for people in about a week's time from now. Before we close this, there is 3 announcements I want to make. One is that this series is not finishing. In January, 13th of January, there will be a next webinar focusing on internal displacement, migration and planned relocation. And we heard already today there was quite a few questions and some references to how do we define some of this key terminology. So again, those 3 on internal displacement, migration and planned relocation are all going back to 14F and the UNFCCC, but also how do we understand them, both from academic, legal and other practices. So 13th of January, next seminar. Another thing that will happen that I think might be of interest to many people on this webinar is that in February, the Platform on Disaster Displacement is going to organize event to look back to the 5th year anniversary of the Paris Agreement, and of course how this is working towards and on displacement. So there will be more information coming on that. And since we have 1 minute left before we need to close, I would also like to call upon Atle Solberg, who's head of the secretariat at the PDD, because he has an announcement I think would be nice to share with this whole group. So over to you, Atle.
Thank you, Nina, and also from our side, thank you so much to all the speakers and participants. Again, we had a very, very strong seminar. So what I just wanted to bring to your attention, and I'm also asking Afrin to maybe put back again what she put earlier in the chat box, is that today the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the government of France, and the vice chair, the government of Fiji, through their ambassador Rivazo for France and Ambassador Khan from Fiji, they signed an MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, one with IOM and one with UNHCR. And these two MOUs were also then signed, of course, by the High Commissioner for Refugee, Grandi, and the Director General, Vittorini. So 2 new MOUs between the Platform on Disaster Displacement and IOM and UNHCR. And we really see this as an opportunity to work closer together and address some of the coherence and coordination issues we have been discussing today. So we are very proud or pleased to have these 2 MOUs in place. And thank you so much to Dina and to Andrew for joining us today. And we look forward to continue working very closely. And maybe just finally, Nina, on the commemoration, the idea of PDD and its steering group is to look back a little on 2015 commitment around the Sendai Framework, the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, and also the Paris Agreement under UNFCCC. So we will announce quite soon such a meeting, commemoration we will call it, whether it's late January or early January, we haven't set the date yet, but please watch this space, and we would extend invitations quite broadly for that event. So thank you so much, Nina, for moderating today, and maybe over to you to close for today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, thank you to all for taking the time, sharing ideas, thoughts, and also I think what came very clearly from Professor Khan, how do we come together from different actors, as we often call it, how do civil society, how does negotiators, how do UN organizations and others, how do we work together to really push the issues of disaster displacement, protection, human mobility, etc., in the global space, but also concretely on national level and local level. So without taking more of your time, I just want on behalf of everyone, the organizers, to say thank you, wishing you a good end of the year break for all of those who can have that. And again, look back here 13th of January for the next seminar in this series. Thank you very much and goodbye for today.